Good evening. I'm David McLaughlin, Provost of New York University, and as Provost, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to what most certainly will be an interesting and important event. One of my most rewarding activities as Provost is to attend just this kind of event, university-wide lectures that feature the work, the ideas, and the scholarship of some of the most distinguished members of NYU's faculty. This evening is particularly gratifying as tonight's event marks the inauguration of a new lecture series that will highlight the work of the university-wide institutes that my office supports and oversees. Lectures in this new series will be held twice a year, with each lecture hosted by one of these institutes. The 10 institutes nourish interdisciplinary collaboration and cross-school activities. They span a wide array of disciplines, each drawing together groups of scholars from across the university and beyond. They range from the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality to the Hemispheric Institute for Performance and Politics, from the Humanities Initiative at NYU to the Institute for African American Affairs, and they include the international houses such as Africa House and China House. The oldest, the New York Institute for the Humanities, was founded over 30 years ago. The newest, the Institute for Public Knowledge, was established just 2 years ago. The Remarque Institute was founded in 1995 under the direction of tonight's speaker, Professor Tony Judt. It was named after Eric Maria Remarque, the author of All Quiet on the Western Front, and whose widow, Paulette Goddard, made a generous bequest to New York University. The Remarque Institute aims to promote the study and discussion of Europe and its neighbors, and to encourage mutual understanding between Americans and Europeans. Among the most high-profile of Remarque's many activities has been its biannual Remarque Lectures. These lectures have gained a distinguished reputation for scholarship and productive thought, provocative thought. I'm very pleased that tonight's Remarque Lecture is also the inaugural lecture for the Institute's lecture series. I will now turn the podium over to my close friend and colleague, Dick Foley, Professor of Philosophy and the university's Vice Chancellor for Strategic Planning. Dick.
Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tony Judt tonight. Tony is, by any measure, one of the great and most influential historians of our time. He's been at NYU for more than 2 decades now, 22 years to be exact. He's served many capacities here at NYU, chair of the history department, dean of humanities, university professor, as Dave said, also founder and director of the Remarque Institute. He came here to NYU from Oxford. Prior to that, he had been at UC Berkeley and King's College, Cambridge. He has, of course, been a prodigious publisher, 13 books, starting with early works on French socialism and intellectualism, to his magisterial but also hugely readable History of Europe since 1945, and his very most recent book, Reappraisals, Reflections on the Forgotten 20th Century. His list of awards and honors seems almost endless. American Academy of Arts and Science, British Academy, Royal Historical Society, Guggenheim Fellow. His book on post-war Europe has been translated into 19 different languages. It's won the Arthur Ross Prize, the Remarque Peace Prize, the Bruno Kreisky Prize, the European Book Prize. And he himself, for lifetime achievement, has won the Hannah Arendt Prize and the Orwell Prize. This is, of course, a spectacular resume, but even it does not capture the full impact and certainly not the texture of Tony's work, which I like to think is linked to one of the qualities about Tony that I admire most, his engagement with the world and the foundation of his work in things that he himself has done, seen, experienced. This engagement began early for Tony. His education was at the finest European institutions, Cambridge and École Normale Supérieure. But before entering Cambridge, he spent what we would now call a gap year in Israel, where there he farmed on a kibbutz and served as a driver during the Six-Day War in 1967. As a young man, he also traveled extensively and exhaustively in Europe, seeing firsthand how it hung together, or in some cases did not hang together. Even now, to this day, he can tell you, as one of his many side expertise, just how long it takes to get by train from, say, Bucharest to Hamburg, what time the trains leave, which track they leave from, where you will have to change. He can tell you these things because he's traveled these lines many, many times, and while traveling, thought how the history and relationship between any two given points in Europe has been shaped by their distance from one another, and how extensive the difficulties are in getting from one point to another. It is this link between ideas and actual lived experience that I think permeates his work and is central to its trajectory. Though sometimes, especially in the early work, it's been the absence of that link that's been the subject of his inquiries. For example, his early books on French intellectuals, which focused in part on the dangerous ease with which ideas, thoughts, theories can weigh sometimes too lightly on one's actions, one's engagement with the world. That gap never exists in Tony's works. And it is one of the primary reasons in my mind why Tony is not just one of the great historians of our time, but also one of the great public intellectuals of our time. It is with enormous pleasure that I introduce Tony Judt to speak on what is living and dead in social democracy. Tony Judt.
Can you hear me? Good, thanks. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope you don't mind if I begin by shooting the elephant in the house, if you'll forgive the first of a number of politically incorrect observations. As you can see, I'm lecturing to you from a wheelchair. The reason is that I was diagnosed a year ago with a progressive variant of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which you will know as Lou Gehrig's disease. This destroys progressively most of the muscles in the body, and in my case, as you can see, it's produced a situation where I'm paralyzed from the neck down, and also use this rather ridiculous-looking tube on my face to breathe, since those muscles don't work either. This has certain advantages from your point of view. I promise you I shall not distractingly walk around the stage. I shall not deploy redundant body language or excessive ersatz Italian hand gestures. What you get this evening, ladies and gentlemen, is the original talking head. Thanks. I should say just a couple more points. A number of people did ask me if I would lecture, instead of on the topic that I'm going to talk about, if I would lecture instead on the disease that I have, Lou Gehrig's disease, because this would be useful to raise public understanding, awareness, and so on. But I'm not a doctor, so what I would have given you would have been a sort of show and tell. It does seem to me that, so far as show is concerned, you can see perfectly well for yourselves what the disease looks like and what it does to people. As far as tell goes, all I can assure you is that this is, in every sense of the word, a non-communicable disease. So you will have to pass on the specialized medical lecture. If I were American, I might have responded more positively to those of my colleagues who said that it would be uplifting for you and for me, for you to see that a quadriplegic wearing facial Tupperware could give a public lecture. But I'm English, and we don't do uplifting. There is, however, one last point, a connection between my condition and my subject. And it's this, that if I lived in Sweden, I would get at least as good medical treatment, but I would save about $100,000 a year. That should give me some justification for slipping into my subject, which is what is living, what is dead in social democracy. If you look over the past few years at public opinion polls and surveys in this country, you'll find that if people are asked, would you like your child to have better life chances at birth? Would you like your wife's survival in maternity to be more guaranteed? Would you like your children to be better educated? Would you like better guarantees of support if you lose your job? Would you like universal medical coverage at low cost? Would you like longer life expectancy? Would you like less crime and more public services? People in this country universally say yes. If they're then told that these things are available in Austria or Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and that they come with somewhat higher taxes and an active role by the state in their provision, they say in those same surveys, no, we do not want socialism. No, we do not want the state interfering in our affairs. And above all, please, no, we don't wish to pay higher taxes. There is this curious cognitive dissonance between the ends that people are willing, in very large numbers, to approve and even seek, and the means that they are unwilling to consider. And I want to ask initially why that is. Obviously, this is an old question in the United States. Over 100 years ago, the German sociologist Werner Sombart asked, why is there no socialism in America? And there are many answers to this, some of which are deeply structural, some of which have to do with the sheer size of the country. It's very hard to institute organized collective activity and services in countries which are essentially empires in scale, whether they are the United States or Brazil or elsewhere. There are also cultural factors of which we're all very well aware. There may also be considerations about which we could not do anything even if we wished. If you ask yourself, what is it that the various countries that have a system of welfare that we associate with social democracy, what do they have in common? Of course, if you think of the list I gave you, your first thought would be that in order to have successful social democracy, you need a large number of people who are able to do cross-country skiing. But it's not by chance that the kinds of system that I'm going to talk about this evening are most successfully implanted in small, homogeneous countries. Scandinavia, Austria, the Netherlands, to take the best-known cases. In these countries, issues of trust, issues of acceptance of a willingness to pay for other people's services, whether in your own generation or in a future generation, it's closely connected with the assumption that they will do the same for you and your children because they are, as it were, like you. And it's not accidental that social democracy and enthusiasm for the welfare state has declined in countries like the Netherlands with the rise of multicultural communities and considerable suspicion about the willingness of others, minorities, who look different and sound different, to behave in the ways that the homogeneous white Protestant community has done for decades before. We don't have that kind of country here, and that may be a consideration. It may also be the case, and I'll come back to this, that social democracy and the welfare states, that they're not quite the same thing, do face real practical problems today, which make them difficult to imagine in the future, not only if you're American, but also for Europeans. But I want to look at a slightly different question. And that is the very difficulty we have in even posing the question of how should we imagine a different sort of society? How should we imagine a different set of collective arrangements to mutual advantage? I want to argue that our problem is not sociological, it's not economic. It is, if you like, forgive me this academic phraseology, discursive. We don't know how to talk about these things anymore. To do this, I want to go back a little in time. And I have on my side Maynard Keynes, whom I shall quote once or twice this evening, who famously wrote that a study of the history of opinion is a necessary preliminary to emancipation of the mind. So to emancipate our minds this evening, I want to study for a minute the history of an opinion. The opinion I have in mind, of course, is what you might call economism, the way we talk about public affairs today. For the last 30 years, in this country, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in general in the English-speaking world, to a much lesser extent in continental Europe and elsewhere, we have lost the capacity to think of public affairs except in, and in a very restricted sense, in economic terms. When we ask of a policy or a proposal, is it good or bad? We don't actually ask, is it good or bad? We ask, is it efficient? Is it productive? Would it benefit gross domestic product? Would it be inefficient in that respect? Would it contribute or not contribute to growth and so on? We ask, in a very restricted sense, economic questions. We talk economics as a language of public policy. That is not a natural condition. It's an acquired one. It's not the first time that people have done this. In 1905, the great William Beveridge, who 40 years later would go on to found the British welfare state, gave a lecture in Oxford where he asked why it was that political philosophy had been obscured in public debates by classical economics. That obscuring of political thought by economic language happened again in the 1920s, and it has happened to us. And it's been going on for a while now. So we've lost, many of us, the capacity to realize that is, in fact, an acquired condition. It's not, by the way that the great classical economists themselves used to think and talk. If you go back to the 18th or 19th century, considerations of ethics, of what Adam Smith called moral sentiment, were uppermost in economic conversations. And indeed, the idea that we might reduce public debate, public policy considerations, to purely financial or economic calculations was already in the 18th century something that worried the more perceptive observers of the early years of capitalism. Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet, in the late 18th century in France, shortly before the Revolution, expressed to him the horrifying thought, and I quote, that liberty will be no more in the eyes of an avid nation, he meant France, than the necessary condition for the security of financial operations. The idea, in short, that we would mistake the freedom to make money for freedom itself. How did we come to think in exclusively economic terms, such that when we have a purportedly national debate about whether or not we should fix our collective arrangements for healthcare, we can only ask, how much will it cost? Who will pay? How much are we willing to sacrifice? And will it be efficient? Rather than, is it good? Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it bad? Is it just? Is it fair? I think I can answer the question. We live, all of us, in the long shadow of a debate that most people in this room will be quite unfamiliar with. If you ask yourself, who are the founding fathers of American and English economic thought today? They are, depending on which particular aspect you look at, 5 men, some of whom will be familiar to you here. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Joseph Schumpeter, Karl Popper, and Peter Drucker. Drucker, a management guru of enormous significance and influence in the 60s, 50s and 60s and 70s in this country. Popper, the great theorist of the open society and its enemies and of totalitarianism. Hayek, the founding father of, as it were, the Chicago School of Economics. Mises, his colleague. Schumpeter, the theorist of creative destruction in capitalism. All 5 of these men were born within, forgive me, a short train journey of Vienna. 4 of them were born in Vienna, 1 of them in Moravia, a few dozen miles to the north. They were all influenced, shaken up by the interwar catastrophe that hit Austria. And little Austria is the source of much of the way we think and fail to think in public life today. Because what happened in interwar Austria was, firstly, of course, the catastrophe of World War I, then a socialist experiment in Vienna, and then progressively a reactionary response to that experiment, and eventually, of course, the Nazi takeover, 1938. All of these men were refugees from that experience, and all of them, Hayek especially, the most influential of them all, cast their thought in terms of a question. Why did liberal society fall, fail, collapse in the face of the challenge of totalitarianism and give way to the extreme right in that case, in the Austrian case? Their answer was because of the unsuccessful attempts by the left to introduce state-directed planning, state-directed services, state-led economic activity, and so forth. That, in other words, the great collapse of European civilization, that for them was the defining quality of the 20th century, the defining question of the 20th century, that had been brought about by the failure of the left. First, to achieve its objectives, and then to defend liberalism against its failed objectives. And their conclusion was, quite simply, that in future, the best defense of liberalism, the best defense of an open society, the best defense of freedom would be to keep government away from the economy. If you kept government away from the economy, if you kept politicians away from planning, regulation, direction, however well-intentioned, left-wing, socialist, social democratic plans to improve society, then you would not open the path to totalitarians of right or left, and you could protect the liberal heritage that they had seen crumble before their eyes, before they fled to America, to England, to New Zealand in Popper's case. Now, there was another person who responded to this same challenge from a different angle. Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, was born in 1883, the same year as Schumpeter. Keynes grew up in a stable, secure, confident, safe, prosperous, powerful England. And he watched in World War I that after the war and into the 30s, as that culture, that economy, that society collapsed and declined and fell, and all the certainties of his culture, his class, fell with them. Keynes responded to the same questions that Hayek and his Austrian colleagues had posed, with a different answer. Yes, he said, the collapse of liberalism, the collapse of the confidence, the certainties of the 19th century is the great question of our time. But the answer to it is not to reduce governments so that there remains a free and untroubled society, but to provide security from above so that people will not, in desperation, turn to the right or to the far left in the hope of protection against the terrifying world. Keynes's response, in other words, to the question he posed in 1944, which was, how shall we provide after the war a security which will prevent a return to the pre-war conditions, was that there must be an increased role for the state. Hayek's was that there must be a reduced role for the state. Both were answering, as they saw it, from the very different circumstances of England and Austria, the challenge of the failure and the collapse of liberalism. Hayek, in 1945, in his classic, The Road to Serfdom, famously wrote speaking of the Labour Party programme which wanted to introduce a welfare state, and I quote, "No description in general terms can give an adequate idea of the similarity of much of current English political literature," he meant the Labour Party programme, "to the works which destroyed the belief in Western civilization in Germany and created the state of mind in which Nazism became successful." In other words, if the Labour Party won in 1945, Nazism would come to England. The Labour Party did win. It implemented policies very close to those which Keynes had advocated. And in England, as in much of the Western world, for the next 30 years, this debate, so to speak, was won by Keynes. Since the 1970s, we have seen the, as it were, revenge of the Austrians. But it bears consideration that in effect what we have done is live through, since the 1970s, the dim echo like a fading star of a debate conducted in the 1930s and 40s about how to defend liberalism against totalitarianism. And in the shadow of that debate, we've learned to talk public policy as neoclassical economics. And this is our problem. The welfare state, which Keynes, Beveridge, and many continental Europeans set up, had remarkable achievements to its credit. In some countries it was social democratic. In others, like England, for example, it was really simply a set of programs to alleviate poverty. Its success lay in the remarkable reduction in inequality. If you compare the range between wealth and poverty, between rich and poor, between high incomes and low incomes, in all continental European countries, and Great Britain, and the United States, from the 1930s to the 1960s, you see a quite drastic shrinking of the gap. With that shrinking of the gap went, along with many other social benefits, the collapse of the fear of a return to extreme politics, the politics of desperation, the politics of envy, the politics of insecurity, and so forth. And we, the Western industrialized world, lived in a 30-year paradise, if you like, bubble, if you will, of security provisions. Now, the paradox of the welfare state and of the social democratic states of Europe was quite simply that its success undermined its support. Firstly, people forgot why they wanted these kinds of securities in the first place. The generation that remembered the 1930s, which was the generation which remained politically active through the early 70s, in all of the West, was implicitly and quite often explicitly committed to preserving those institutions, those systems of taxation, those systems of social services, state provision, which would prevent a return to the remembered horrors of the 1930s. This was true, by the way, of the middle class as much as it was of poorer social classes. what social democracy in Scandinavia, the welfare states of continental Europe and the UK did for the middle class was, if anything, more strikingly effective in binding the middle class to liberal democracy than it was for the working population. Because the middle class got, by middle class I mean the European sense, professional people, people with solid, secure incomes, but not rich. They got all the welfare and social provisions that the poor got: free education, cheap or free medicine and health, insurance, protection, pensions, and so forth. But they were therefore left with a much greater disposable income, since they did not have to spend their own earned income on these things beyond what they paid in tax. And so the middle class of Europe, precisely that class which had been most adrift in the 1930s, was bound closely to the post-war democratic states by the very social systems that had been introduced in theory to benefit those below them. The forgetting of these background considerations was an important part of what happened in the 70s. Since the 1970s, inequality has opened up again. The inequalities, which were diminished steadily in the West from the 1870s through the 1960s in a variety of ways, were reopened and expanded and increased. Today, the so-called Gini coefficient, which is an economic measure of the gap between rich and poor, wealth and poverty, is the same in this country as it is in China. When you consider that China is a classic case of a developing country where there is bound to be huge gaps between the wealthy few and the impoverished many, the fact that we in this country have a wealth gap approximating to that of China tells you something about how far back we have moved. More than that, take a look at the 1996 law introduced and signed by Clinton, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, the more Orwellian title I could not offer you. It's the act which essentially reformed welfare in this country. It should remind you all of another act passed in 1834 in England, the so-called New Poor Law. Please don't shake your heads. You all know the New Poor Law very well. The reason you know it, of course, is because in his second complete novel, Charles Dickens targeted the New Poor Law, which introduced the workhouses. Oliver Twist is about the New Poor Law. When Noah Claypole famously sneers at Oliver and calls him workus, he was doing for 1838 what we do today when we sneer at someone and say, welfare queen, welfare. What we have done after a century in which we moved from the idea that people are full members of a polity by virtue of being citizens, we've moved back to the idea that you can only be the full member of a society if you work. If you don't have work, then you are in some sense an inferior person. You are slightly less of a citizen. You are required to do certain things. You must take a job at whatever wage is available. If you don't do that, then you're not entitled to the collective support of your fellow citizens. Your entitlement comes to you only if you pay a price in what you're willing to do and how low you are willing to go. The 19th century called that least eligibility. You went into the workhouse only if you were unable to find work, even at a rock bottom wage. And for the next 100 years, 140 years, social reformers all across Europe and the States fought to get rid of this stigma. The stigma which defined citizens by their economic position, their ranking, their opportunity for work, their lack of it, how much they earned, and so forth. Rights were assigned people by virtue of their citizenship rather than as a consequence of the status they held in the economic table, as it might be. We have reverted to that old system. We have reverted in this country and in England, and there have been moves, so far mostly unsuccessful, to do so in continental Europe as well. Why we should have felt the desire to do this is unclear. Why we would wish to move from a system which we had achieved by the 60s, whereby all of our fellow citizens had equal rights, equal standing, and if they, by some misfortune, failed to find a job, failed to find a place in the economic life of the nation, they did not lose because of that. Standing, presence, opportunity, rights, credibility in the social life of the nation. We've moved back, and it's interesting to ask why we've done this, why we fail to produce a language which stigmatizes this change, condemns this change as a step back into an earlier period, an earlier time, which men and women did so much to fight their way out of. It's certainly true that it's very easy to accept new realities, new circumstances, new inequalities, striking inequalities of the kind we now have, if everyone else treats them as normal. We can take Tolstoy's word for this. In Anna Karenina, he observes in passing that there are, and I quote, no conditions of life to which a man cannot get accustomed, especially if he sees them accepted by everyone around him. But this disposition to admire, and I'm quoting again, and almost to worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect, persons of poor, mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Adam Smith, who regarded the risk that we would come to admire wealth, despise poverty, admire success, scorn failure as the greatest risk, the greatest sentimental, ethical risk that we faced in the new commercial society that he could see coming. And it's now upon us. Well, let me give you perhaps what seems to me the most striking example of the kind of problem we face. And it comes in the form of what will strike many of you as a rather anodyne economic process, the process of privatization. In the last 30 years, the cult of privatization has taken over Western governments. Why? The shorthand version is that it's cheap. If you have an inefficient public program or publicly owned activity, whether it's a waterworks, an electric company, a trade system, a factory, you sell it. If you sell it, you bring money into the state. You sell it to someone in the private sector, they're more efficient because of the profit motive. The thing in question works better, the state offloads an inappropriate responsibility, and the public sector earns a bit of money in the sale. But that's the theory. The practice is very different. What we've experienced over the last 30 years is the steady unloading of public responsibility into the private sector. In the first place, this is not efficient. Most of the things that governments have seen fit to offload onto the private sector, they wanted to offload because they're not profitable. Whether it's a railway company or a coal mine or a utility, a gas utility or whatever. And in order to get people to buy it in a public offering, when they sell it, they have to sell it cheap. When they sell it cheap, the public takes a loss. I'll give you one example. It's been calculated that when, in the course of the Thatcher-Blair privatizations from 1980 through the late 1990s, because of the deliberately low price at which long-standing public assets were sold to the private sector, £14 billion was transferred from the tax-paying public to the private purchasers. A further £3 billion was transferred to the City of London in the form of fees, charges to the banks which handled the transactions. £17 billion, $30 billion, in other words, shifted from the public to the private sector in order to get the private sector to buy public assets they would not otherwise have been willing to buy. $30 billion, that's, give or take, the endowment of Harvard, the annual gross domestic product of Paraguay or Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's a very large sum of money. It's not obviously an efficient way for a government to use public money. Secondly, the famous question of moral hazard arises. The reason that people in the private sector are willing to buy apparently inefficient public sector goods is because the public sector underwrites the outcome. Buy this railway, or in the case of London, give you a precise example, buy the London Tube. If it doesn't make a profit, we will compensate you. If it does make a profit, it's yours. Now, firstly, this undermines the classic economic argument for privatization, which is that the profit-based private sector will be more efficient. Secondly, of course, by promising someone that even if they don't make a profit, they make a profit, you undermine their motive to make a profit. This is called, pretentiously, moral hazard. But thirdly, most of the goods which the state sells off, it sells off because it cannot itself run them very well, but is nonetheless obliged to regulate in one form or another. And as a consequence, it continues to subsidize, support, guarantee the private activities which remain half public, half private. This is not just inefficient, it takes us back to a very old story about the way states discredit themselves. If you are audited today, and my apologies to those members of the audience under 21, for whom this may not seem to matter very much, but for those of you who might imagine being audited, in this country or in England, you will not be audited by the state. You'll be audited by a private company which has contracted with the state, pretty much the same way that private companies contracted with the government in Iraq, or the way private companies in England today contract with the government to provide residential care services for the elderly. The government farms out, in other words, its responsibilities to private companies. In the 18th century in France, this was called tax farming. The government was not very efficient, not very good collecting taxes. So what it would do would be to invite bids from private individuals to collect the taxes for it. The highest bidder got to be the tax collector. He was then free to collect as much money as he could, and it all went to him. He, in turn, paid the government the agreed figure, the government discounting, so to speak, its tax income for the guarantee that it would get something. And then the guy would go out and screw the peasants in any way he could to get the maximum amount in. It was decided after the fall of the Ancien regime that this is a very inefficient system. Firstly, it discredits the state. Secondly, you bring in less money than you otherwise would. Thirdly, you get very disgruntled peasants. In this country today, we have a discredited state, and less money comes in than otherwise would. Curiously, what's the matter with Kansas? We don't get disgruntled peasants, but the problem is the same. We have sold many of the state's responsibilities to the private sector. The advantage of this is clear in terms of reducing the state's responsibilities, but the price is clear. It reduces the state's credibility and its standing. What you get are gated communities, in many senses of the word. Communities, parts of society that do not feel that they deal directly with the state. They deal with intermediary individuals. They deal with private entrepreneurs acting for the state or doing things the state used to do, but doing them either less well or at a higher cost. And in either case, reducing our sense of allegiance to the state, proximity to the state, and commonality with fellow citizens. This has been very well theorized by one of its greatest practitioners, Margaret Thatcher, notoriously said of social policy, and I quote, "There is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women and families." But if there are only individual men and women and families, and the state keeps its distance from them, and there is no sense of collective responsibility, collective activity, collective goods that we share in common and for which the state is responsible, whether those goods are a road, the provision of medical care, the collecting of taxes, the provision of armed protection. We now have private police forces, something that the modern state spent 100 years working to get rid of in the course of the 19th and early 20th century. If you don't have those things, then you lack anything that separates the individual from the state. And all you have is the state as a repressive force, the state as an absent government, and individuals at the bottom competing for power and position within the space between them and that state. The consequences of this are not attractive. They were not attractive before the modern state arose, and it was well observed in the early years of the building modern responsible states that the idea, and I quote again, is essentially repulsive of a society held together only by the relations and feelings arising out of private interest. That was written by John Stuart Mill, another great liberal classical economist. What then is to be done? Where can we go from here? We have to begin with the notion of the state. The state as the incarnation of collective interests, collective purposes, collective goods. The state which does not slough off its responsibilities onto the private sector, but is specifically responsible for certain things that the private sector cannot do or cannot do fairly and consistently. There are, after all, but certain public institutions that society needs, and of which, and I quote again, the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals. Only the state could perform them. Adam Smith. What can the state do? What should it do? There are certain things we can no longer recover from the old approach to state-centered government. The 20th century narrative of the state was bound up with the idea that progressives, socialists, reformers had history on their side. The universe, in the words of the late philosopher Bernard Williams, was cheering on our projects. We knew we were on the side of history. We don't know that anymore. We don't have confident stories to tell about the purposes of history, about the way history is moving, the way societies are moving, the collective purposes that we could be sure we should be aiming at. We've lived through a century of ideologies which purported very confidently to know what the state should do and to tell individuals that the state knew better than them. We can't return to that. So we have to know that there are limits on what we can ask of an activist state. We also can't return to the confident rhetoric and language of social democracy itself. That language of the left, which emerged before World War I, flourished in the post-World War II years, and shaped much of what I was describing earlier as the great generation of social democratic welfare states. It's not accidental that today in Europe, social democrats do badly again and again and again at elections, even in traditionally social democratic countries, even in the midst of a shameful, catastrophic financial crisis. The reason is because their language no longer bears any convincing relationship to their programs. Social democracy emerged as the alternative within the left to Marxist socialism and a little later to communism. If you look at the great texts of the Social Democrats from the 30s and 40s, they are all defensively targeted towards their left. We are democratic, they say, not authoritarian. We believe in freedom, not repression. We are not communists, to some extent, although this varied. We are not Marxists. We are Democrats who happen to believe in social justice and so on. When the main objective of Social Democrats was to show that they were not communists and to implant themselves firmly in liberal societies as plausible alternative governments, this made sense. Today, this rhetorical tick makes no sense. It's not accidental that Angela Merkel can win an election in Germany against social democratic opposition with a set of policies that essentially resemble theirs. The Social Democrats of today have a problem. They won in Europe. Social democracy, in one form or another, is, with apologies to Molière, the prose that people speak. It's the way they talk politics. They make assumptions about the state, about social services, state provisions, and so forth. So Social Democrats, they have nothing distinctive to offer. They have no narrative to offer, no story which distinguishes them from the center and center-right mainstream. It's different in this country, and I'll come back to that. But Social Democrats need a new language. They need to begin by asking, how should we talk politics, before asking, what are our policies? The policies are not the problem. So what can be recovered? We can't recover that old, self-confident vocabulary, that historically informed vocabulary, that vocabulary which separated Democrats from authoritarians, but there are no longer any authoritarians against which to separate yourself. Well, we could begin with the practices of social democracy. What, after all, is distinctive about the kinds of policies, the kinds of approach to policies that I want to bring out here in the next 10 or 15 minutes before I stop? The first is, and I'll use, if I may, railways. I believe something was said about railways earlier to illustrate my point. Imagine a railway station. I mean a real railway station, not Penn Station, which is an unsuccessful 1960s shopping mall over a cellar. And not Grand Central, which is a glorious mausoleum over a commuter railway station. I mean, something like Waterloo Station in London, the Gare de l'Est in Paris, Central Station in Milan, Berlin's magnificent new terminal. If you look at these stations, you can see that there is no reason why the sandwich bar should be in the public sector. The private sector does sandwich bars better. I remember from my childhood when British Railways sandwich bars were in the public sector. And this is one arena in which competition works. But you cannot run trades competitively. Trades like agriculture are both the economic and the public service. We can't render them more efficient by putting two trains on a track, see which one is run better, as it were. You can actually do this. The English, God help them, have tried this with bus services. You have competing bus services. What happens, of course, is that the bus service is more profitable, which only stops at the profitable stops. Does not go into the little villages where the impoverished old ladies live, and provides an express service for people who can afford it. The state then has to pick up the tab and provide the unprofitable, inefficient bus service, which is a social service, not an economic one. The same is true of trains, which are social services in the sense that anyone could run an efficient, profitable train service if all you had to do was make it go from London to Edinburgh, Paris to Marseille, Boston to New York. But if you want to run a train service which provides the service that people may have occasion to use in areas where they won't use it frequently, but it will have to be used sometimes, then someone is going to have to pay for that. Then it will require public subsidy. And the only reason you can justify the public subsidy is by a theory of what a social service should look like. In 1996, the last year before the British trains were privatized, the British subsidy for the train service was £9 per head of the population. The French subsidy was £21 per head of the population. The Italian, same year, £33. That difference is reflected in the train service that's provided. It explains why the British service was so poor, which was why it was privatized, but could only be privatized at great loss, as I said. But it also explains what the French and Italians were doing. They had a concept of trains as a social provision. If you run a train to a remote country region, you not only keep that part of the society alive, you reduce the environmental damage that's done by the need to use cars if there is no train service. And of course, you have the collective sense of what kind of a country you are trying to preserve and promote. That constitutes a sense of collective purpose. If the question you asked was simply, how can we make this train service efficient? You would think very differently. You would close down the inefficient parts. You would sell off the efficient parts. And then you would wonder why you had so many cars on the subsidized roads that now substituted for the non-existent railway service. The public-private distinction here is crucial. Only the state can meet demands that all of us have, but we don't have, each one of us, all the time. I don't want to go up to Vermont every day, and I'm certainly probably not willing to put aside the sum of money every week to make sure that there's a train for when I do want to go. But when I do want to go, it's good that there's a train to take. Only the state can think collectively, provide the option that we will not separately provide, but that we collectively desire in aggregate. There's another way to think about what the state should do. And that is to ask ourselves, what are the social goods that we believe in? Not what works or what's productive, but what do we want in the first place? Let me give you an example. It's cheaper, on the whole, to provide benevolent assistance to the poor. than to provide a full range of social services to them. Benevolent assistance, meaning churches, private charities, private foundations, occasional assistance in the form of food stamps and so on. But it's humiliating to be on the receiving end of that kind of assistance. It's not humiliating to be on the receiving end of a right, the right to whatever it might be, welfare, unemployment assistance, housing, and so forth. Now you may say, and we are used to saying, but it's so much cheaper to provide the benevolent assistance that that's what we should do, provided that there's enough of it. But what if we treated humiliation as a social cost? What if we said that there is something wrong about a society in which people are humiliated in order to get the necessities of life? What if we factored in, so to speak, humiliation as a cost or benefit? Then it's not efficient to allow people to be humiliated. And then we might well say, as indeed in some societies we have said, that we should provide the social services even though they're more expensive, even if they're less efficient, because we are, in a broader sense of our calculations, acting efficiently in pursuit of our broader objectives. That is a way of saying that social democracy consists, and has to consist, in articulating what we think the good society is. We have lost the capacity not to do that, but to talk about it. Ask yourself again, what do you think of the conversation now going on around healthcare? Or ask yourself about the infamous torture memos of the previous administration, in which highly educated, young, middle-aged men exchanged complicated, thoughtful memos on the pros and cons of torturing people. What struck me upon reading those was that never did you see the question raised as to whether this was the right or wrong thing to do. It was asked, is it efficient? Is it instrumentally functional? Does it achieve its goal? I saw one memo which even asked, in a sophisticated philosophical sort of way, whether on rural utilitarian grounds we should torture, i.e., is it wise to torture, even if it works, because we might be setting up precedents and practices that we would not, on other grounds, find very functional. But never was it asked, is this evil? Is this good? Is this right? Is it wrong? Is it just? Is it unjust? That's a vocabulary that we need to reintroduce into public discourse. We can do it by starting with the question of what kind of society we want. There are two ways to do that. One is, if you like, the normative way, to simply say, let's begin again to think what sort of purposes, what sort of narrative, if you like, within which we wish to place public policy debate, public policies, public choices. Let's learn to talk in a moral narrative and then make decisions from within it rather than from within the economic narrative that we've become accustomed to. That's hard. Social democrats used to do that, but because their narrative was inserted in a historical one, they didn't have to ask, is something right or wrong, but is it moving in the right historical direction? Is capitalism doomed, or is capitalism the future? We have to ask, because those questions don't make sense to us anymore. We have to ask what's right and what's wrong about a particular policy. To do that, we have to have a larger sense of what we mean by those words. The second option would be to return to the 18th century, which I've quoted once or twice here, and ask, what is it about commercial society, as they called it, financial capitalism, as we might call it, that is abhorrent to us? What is it that we instinctively find wrong about our public arrangements? And what can we do about those within terms that make sense to us, which respond to our sense of fairness, which respond to our sense of impropriety, which respond to our sense of something that we've lost, something we know but don't articulate very well collectively, something that's wrong when we have private police forces, something that's wrong when we farm out responsibility for tax collection, something that's wrong when we farm out responsibility for the care of the aged. But there's a third way to think, and I'll close on this one. We are now entering, I believe, a new age of insecurity. The last age of insecurity was the one that Keynes brilliantly described. By age of insecurity, I mean this. The great age of what was not then called globalization, the first great age, ended in 1914. No one expected it to end. Everyone then believed in internationalization, the endless, necessary, benevolent increase in trade, in peace, in stability, in prosperity, in growth, and so forth. Keynes himself brilliantly described this, of course, in the opening paragraphs of the economic consequences of the peace, the pamphlet he wrote in 1921 about why the Versailles Treaty would not work, describing the world before 1914 as he remembered it. We, I think, are entering a similar period. We are entering an age of economic insecurity. We're entering an age of cultural insecurity. We're entering a period when people will no longer be so sure as they were from 1950 to 1980 that the world their children see will look like the world that they knew. We are going to need to rediscover somehow the ways in which an earlier generation responded to insecurity, to the dangers of insecurity, the political extremes which emerge, the difficulties that people have in believing that present arrangements are likely to endure, and the risk that they will turn to siren voices as an alternative to the insecurities of their own existence. Social democracy in Europe, the New Deal here, the Great Society here, were responses to that insecurity from a generation which experienced it. We, I think, who have not experienced it, most of us, the younger members of the audience here, cannot know what it meant to see a world collapsed, the world of liberal Europe, that collapsed into the catastrophe out of which the Hayek-Keynes debate with which I began emerged, and from which the Keynesian consensus that we grew up in was born. and which was forgotten in the reversion to a pre-Keynesian view of endless security, and therefore no need to worry about how to preserve it, of the last 30 years. If social democracy has a future, it has a future as the language of fear, if you like. Not the language of endless, hopeful progress, but the language of memory. When the social democrats of the 19th century first emerged, they were talking about the future that was yet to be created, in which there would be reduced inequality, public services, a state which acted on behalf of all, in which there would be collective purposes, collective services, collective institutions, public goods. That was achieved. We are now losing it. The task of social democracy now is to remember not only what was achieved, but the consequences of a failure to achieve it. The consequences of a failure to recall what happens to a liberal society when it enters an age of uncertainty and insecurity. Social democracy, public goods, collective welfare, state provision of the services that today we inadequately provide privately. They are not a perfect answer. What we've learned from the 20th century is the perfect answers are frighteningly imperfect. But my own feeling, my own sense of social democracy as a possible language, a possible alternative, possible way to begin to talk publicly about our collective goals, is that it's all we have. We should be angrier than we are, much angrier than we are, about what we've lost rhetorically, collectively, ethically, in the 3 decades that we moved away from the astonishing achievements of the previous 100 years. There is something to return to, something worth fighting for, something worth collectively aspiring to. I would end, if I may, by quoting George Orwell on a quite different occasion. Returning from Barcelona in his classic, Homage to Catalonia, and writing, and I quote, "There was much in it." He's speaking of Barcelona, the revolution, 1937. "There was much in it that I did not understand. Some ways I did not even like it. I was not sure that it could work. I was not sure that it did work. But I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for." That, I believe, is true, whatever we can retrieve from the 20th century memory of social democracy. I leave you with that thought. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. There's microphones in each aisle. I would ask people to come forward. Keep your questions brief. Questions? It's hard to see through the lights here. Okay, very good, very good. There's a microphone right behind you.
Okay, so on a daily basis, if you're having a conversation, say even a debate about some of these issues, and the word socialism is mentioned, sometimes it's as though a sort of brick has fallen on the conversation, and there's no way to return it to its form. It's sort of indistinguishable. What would you suggest on a daily argumental basis you would do to restore this conversation to its form?
I'm not sure if I ought to reveal the identity of the questioner, but he's my younger son, Nicholas. And that kind of conversation happens with terrifying regularity at our dinner table. Okay, look. Firstly, you have the great good fortune and the cultural disadvantage of being born American. The brick does not fall in quite the same way in Denmark, but it does fall all the same. The answer to your question comes in two parts. The first is that we cannot get away from the fact that we have lived through a century in which the word socialism was both pejoratively and enthusiastically identified with political systems which turned out to be, or could be seen to have been from the beginning, both economically inefficient, politically repressive, and culturally sterile. We can't deny that. There's no point in pretending otherwise. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was, after all, by its own account, socialist. Most communist states described themselves in various ways for various purposes, constitutionally and so on, as socialist. I don't think there's much point defending the word. What we have to do is rather different, and that is shift the conversation from abstractions to substance. I'm not interested, even if I were to live another 20 years, in trying to promote some abstraction called socialism. If I'm going to promote abstractions, I'd rather promote justice or fairness. I'd rather promote equality. I would promote equality, by the way, not because this could get you off a hook on your socialist conversation, not because of a belief in the desirability of sameness, but because inequality advances many things that we do not like. Inequality advances poverty. Inequality advances ill health. Inequality advances shortness of life expectancy, poverty, ignorance, and many abstractions, which even in your brick-laden conversation, you'll have no trouble defending the undesirability of. We don't want inequality. We don't want injustice for many similar reasons. We don't want unfairness. And what I think can be reasonably well demonstrated is that a system which rests upon respect, admiration for wealth, respect, admiration for the acquisition of possessions and goods, advantage, privilege over persons who doesn't necessarily therefore become disadvantaged, unprivileged, with lack of access to necessities. That system cannot meet our desire, our intuitive desire for justice, for equality, for an end to unfairness, and so on. And that is why we need something other than what we have. Does not mean we need or want socialism. We don't have to resort to the isms of the 19th century in order to justify 21st century social purposes, social ambitions. But you do need to be much more willing than we are to say what is wrong with the way we currently live. That gets you off the hook of defending something which is not the alternative to what we currently do. There are many alternatives to what we currently do. Don't be on the defensive. Go on the attack. Ask if socialism is so very undesirable, what exactly is it that's so very desirable about a system in which over the last 20 years we have produced an outcome whereby the chief executives of the top 200 companies in this country earn approximately 365 times the average wage of their employees, when 30 years ago they earned about 45 times that amount. Something has gone wrong, that it's not the absence of socialism. I hope that helps.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Professor Judd. I really appreciated the comments. You've opened up some big questions. But I do have to respectfully disagree, right?
Sure.
Because social democracy is not all that we have. We do have communism. We have a different synthesis of communism. And in that context, I would invite the audience and you to check out Raymond Lotta's talk on October 26th at the Cantor Film Festival. Everything you know about you've been told about communism is wrong, capitalism is a failure, and revolution is the solution. And it puts forth in Bob Avakian's new synthesis of communism, which builds on Mao's ruptures with Stalin and goes beyond, right? But a big part of it is the reason this has been ruled off the map is there are a lot of lies, slander, and disinformation about communism and the past experiences.
We need a question, please.
I really unite with your sentiments about torture, that the discussion isn't about whether it works or not works, right? But the point is that is it possible to talk about social democracy?
We do need a question.
Is it possible to talk about social democracy and these states' prosperity in Europe and the United States without talking about slavery, colonialism, and imperialism?
Thank you. Tony?
I will concede readily that it's extremely difficult to talk about the prosperity, the advantages, the success, the privileges of the social democratic capitalist states of the Atlantic and Northwest Europe. I'm not asking for a response, if you will concede that it's not possible to talk about communism without reference to the Gulag.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Let me ask a devil's advocate question here. So you pointed out that social democratic countries with a high level of solidarity basically work in small, middle-class, white countries, which are ethnically not so diverse, which is kind of my observation as well. So do we have to choose between being ethnically diverse and multicultural on the one side, or having a society which depends on solidarity? So is that a contrast, or would it work otherwise?
Lady, if I knew the answer, I'd be in Brussels running the joint. Look, I wasn't joking. Okay, I was joking, but I was only half joking on the subject of cross-country skiers. It is true that historically most of the successful solidarist experiments that have endured across generations and across classes have been in countries with few outsiders, few minorities, not necessarily rich countries. Scandinavia was not rich in the 1930s and 40s. Austria certainly not. But the problem of the minorities is a real one, but it should be understood politically and not culturally. The problem in, for example, Denmark, to take one case, or the Netherlands, is that the decline of the social democratic consensus is actively accelerated by politicians taking advantage of the presence of a visible minority, whether religiously visible or different color or linguistically different, to advance a local agenda. The irony is that very often that's an agenda that we would recognize as more or less social democratic. The great irony in Holland, for example, is that the most anti-Moroccan, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic sentiments come from a party or two parties which advance what they call Dutchism, the belief that there is a native Dutch culture of tolerance, solidarity, mutuality, etc., which sounds an awful lot to our ear like social democracy, but which, of course, doesn't include these people from the outside who are thought not to share it. The task we face, in other words, is to redescribe social solidarity in languages which don't correspond so closely to the language of ethnic solidarism, the language of us versus them, the language of protecting us against the danger that they pose to our utopia, so to speak. That suggests to me that it's not impossible, that it's a political choice. There's nothing about Denmark today or the Netherlands which makes social policies of the kind they've practiced for 30, 40 years, public health policies, policies of social solidarity, policies of income transfer and so on. Nothing about their changed cultural mix that makes those technically impossible. They're rendered difficult by the uses to which cultural difference is put politically. So I see that as a political challenge, not some sort of structural impossibility.
You think it's doable?
I think it's doable, yes.
Because, even in the United States, it's easier to get an Irishman to give money to Ireland than to his fellow black neighbor.
You surprise me.
No, that's actually the case.
Okay. You want one more? One final question.
You have one over there, I think.
Hi. You're saying that we need to make a major change in language, but also values, I think, and change that I would certainly support. We just went through a crisis that I think has the color of the issue that you're talking about, the financial crisis I'm talking about of last year and 2 years ago, and a failure of I don't want to call it classical capitalism, but let's just call it a failure of capitalism, and a massively government response, which arguably stanch the damage. I find it dispiriting, and I'm curious to know if you do, that we just went through a crisis of failure of capitalism, successful government response, and yet the dialogue hasn't changed, the underlying feeling of it hasn't changed, and you're talking about having to make that kind of change, and we know our chief of staff just said you never waste a good crisis. I feel like, where's the change going to come from if we've just had this kind of crisis and there hasn't been any, even the shadow of it?
Okay, thank you. I don't agree. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I don't agree that we went through the crisis of capitalism. As the Italians say, magari, I wish. We went through a very distinctive crisis of unregulated financial markets, and it was solved in a rather dispiriting way by the state entering in as the supporter of last resort to the practitioners of those momentarily failed markets. What is wrong is our failure to be more, I guess angry is the right word, that we are, that we should live in a situation like this and have no response to it. And this is not a uniquely American problem. The socialists of Europe, social democrats of Germany, the left in Italy, the left in France, God help us, have no response to this crisis. Partly this is, in a way, structurally, for the same reason that they had no response to the 1931 crisis either, which also ushered in a series of conservative or right-wing governments on the back of a major economic collapse. The left doesn't know what to do with unsuccessful capitalism, because the story of the left, of course, historically, was that capitalism keeps on succeeding until it finally fails once and for all. Till it fails once and for all, they didn't have much to say on the subject. It hasn't failed once and for all. What has failed is our ability, our capacity to articulate an alternative governmental response to a distinctive partial failure of the financial system. You can't blame the bankers, as it were, for this. And I don't just say that because I see some in this room that don't wish to cause offense. This is a failure on our own part. We don't know how to talk ethically about politics. We don't know how to say that something is wrong. We don't know how to say that something is unjust. We know how to say it's unfair, but only with respect to our personal situation vis-à-vis a given crisis, a given action, a given consequence. I think that I find it very sad that the present administration, in which so many hopes were vested, not least by the younger generation in this room, should have found so little fierceness, so little urgency in now, that it has nothing to offer by way of a response, except to invite the same crisis to happen in a few years' time. We need to go much beyond the present language that we use. For example, we talk blithely of globalization as either causing or curing a given set of economic tensions, difficulties. We look at India or China. We don't look very closely. Take India. Approximately 1 billion people, about 400 million people estimated to be in paid work. 1.3 million of that 400 million work in the so-called new economy or any aspect of the globalized economy. The remaining 398 million still work in the pre-globalized world. Much of the world does not live or work in the imagined economic universe that we rhetorically inhabit when we talk about our world today. We need to ask very different kinds of questions about the choices and the politics that we opt for. One last point on that. We assume very readily that globalization is a given. We must adapt. Like it or not, good or bad, but we must adapt. Globalization, arguably, will have, predictably, perhaps it already is having, a very unglobalizing response politically. The globalization before 1914 produced the reversion politically to states, protectionism, authoritarian responses to outside threats, authoritarian protection against external insecurity, political responses to economic crisis. We shall probably, in the next decade, 2 decades, see the same thing, with the state as the intermediate institution, responding, acting, protecting well or badly, not clear, to the threats that globalization is perceived as posing to voting populations in individual countries. This may be an internationalized economy, but we vote politically, make political choices, still within individual states. So it's at the level of the state that we should be looking to see what sort of policies we practice, what sort of political language we favor, what sort of regulations we are willing to see. I don't think the issue of whether or not capitalism is going to collapse is on the table, but whether the state is up to the challenge of responding to the inadequacies of capitalism, that very much is on the table. It's been on the table on and off since 1914. What I think we don't realize is that it's back on the table in a more serious and significant way for the first time in 80 years. Okay.
We'll do you. You've been waiting patiently. This will be the last question. I'll ask you to be brief.
Patience is rewarded. My name is Joanne Landy, and I guess I just want to both appreciate what you say about how coarsened our society has become just in the last 30 years. I mean, when I was growing up, you didn't have homeless people, except for people who were mentally ill, but you didn't have people who were homeless like you see in today's paper because their house was foreclosed. This is now, and really since the age of Reagan, acceptable. And this acceptability, I think, is what you're challenging. At the same time, though, I don't think that the justice, equality, and what was the other one? Fairness that you hope to achieve, especially on a global basis, is really possible without challenging capitalism. I think that what we have now are corporate actors who are wreaking exactly the havoc that you describe on global populations and on us, and that unless we find ways to replace their rule with democratic rule, I think we're lost. You're right that we have to remember the Gulag, and I think that's the first thing we have to say is that we reject Stalin, Stalinism, and all of that, despite what the first speaker said. But I think what we need to do is find democratic ways to run ourselves locally and globally.
Thank you. Tony?
Well, motherhood and apple pie. I couldn't agree more. But I'm reminded of something in Beatrice Webb's memoirs. Beatrice Webb, the sanctimonious, self-important, self-sufficient, talented, gifted, pedantic, co-founder of the Fabian movement, and one of the early British democratic socialists. She used to go down to the East End of London, and she reported there in the 1890s, meeting people who she politely avoids describing as Jewish revolutionaries, but who were the socialists of the East End of London, rather like the socialists of the East End, the Lower East Side of Manhattan 10, 20 years afterwards. And she said that her conversations with these gentlemen, all named Insky and Shmuel and so on, was enlightening, mystifying at the same time. Enlightening because these guys had a radical, uncompromising, absolutely non-negotiable view that capitalism was the problem, socialism the solution, that anything in between was moral, political compromise, economic ignorance, and cultural abandonment. And she would come away exhilarated as she went back to the West End, to her nice upper middle class Christian life. And then she would ask herself, over drinks with her even more boring, sanctimonious, self-important, boring husband Sydney, she would ask herself, that's fine, but how do we get there? And she spent the rest of her life trying to work out how you get there. That our task is not to say that capitalism is the problem. That's dead easy. It's not to point out that rapacious corporations, overpaid investment bankers, are trashing much of what we built up over the last 100 years. That's easy too. It's also largely true. The question is, how do you get there? That's the hard one. You get there by those kind of conversations that the young gentleman who asked the first question was alluding to. You take socialism off the table. Not because it's bad, but it's like talking about your ex-wife. Sure, she was bad. But the present is the present. You don't have to worry about her. You're into the next one. Okay?
So this was an evening that everybody expected it to be full of Tony's intelligence, his deep historical knowledge, and his courage. Tony Judt, thank you for being Tony Judt.